for love right now.
All right. Oh, let me get everyone in. All right. Welcome all. Hello, hello. Welcome back to the NCPEID AP Collaborative. I'm Melissa Bittner. I'm the chair of the NCPEID membership subcommittee. And we have another exciting addition here today. As always, we will be live on Facebook. In addition, we are recording this for the NCPEID YouTube page, and we'll have it on Scott's What's New in Adapted Physical Education podcast. We have three great experts today. We're going to talk about podcasting today. So that's going to be our topic. And I guess one thing I want to shout out and say thanks to Risto, because actually the NCPEID APE podcast, we kind of started up with the PEIT collaborative, or sorry, not NCPEID AP podcast, the NCPEID AP collaborative. We started because of the PEIT collaborative that you all began, you and a group of others started in response to the pandemic. And at NCPEID, we're like, wow, we need an opportunity for us to share kind of what's the hot topic, what's going on in APE. I know, and again, thank you, because I know that you've done a few sessions, about APE, but we're like, of course, APE, we have lots of hot topics, lots of things we wanted to start. So, we kind of reflected that and began this one. So thank you for the inspiration. Can we make sure everyone's on mute? All right. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right, make sure everyone's on mute, y'all. So today,
I think you can just boot that person out.
okay. Yep.
Yeah, please remove him.
Okay, working on it. Trying to find them. Okay. Remove. Got it. Done. Okay. So today we're going to have our three podcasters, Scott, Risto, and Chris, each talk about their different podcasts. We'll have a chance for the audience to ask any questions, and then we're going to have a little panel discussion just about adapted PE, general PE. Okay, I booted the wrong person, clearly.
I know.
Make me a co-host as well if you want.
No, don't do it, buddy.
Close the
Make
meeting.
me host, bitch.
Okay, gone. That's entertaining. All right.
You can close the meeting if you want, because that will make sure that nobody else jumps back in.
Okay. All right. Made you co-host just in case, so we can multitask this in case they bounce back on. Thanks as always to my NCPEID membership subcommittee members, Danielle Musser, Andy Pitchford, Heidi Ambrosius, myself, and Lainey Case. So to begin, we'll have, after that very interesting introduction, we'll have Scott McNamara.
Hello, yeah, no, that was exciting to have that introduction. I've always enjoyed that stuff. It's actually been a minute since I've had like a Zoom, what do you call it, a Zoom bomb, I believe it is. So
Yeah.
Hello everyone, my name is Scott McNamara, and I have a podcast called What's New in Adapted Physical Education. I'm at the University of New Hampshire. Really quickly, I'll tell you, my wife, and I'll say this in the next slide, but the podcast has been going on for 7 years, 7.5 years or something. I kind of stumbled into it. My wife calls it moderately unsuccessful, and probably all three podcasters would fall under this realm of being successful enough that people listen to it, which is exciting, but not successful enough to make any profits off of it. So that we call it moderately unsuccessful in my household, although it's not really the thing that drives us anyway with doing this. So and just my research is all about kind of working with administrators. I've started researching the use of podcasts, which has been nice to kind of put everything together, which includes knowledge translation and all of that. So all right. So yeah, and just some key information again is my podcast has been around for about 7 years. Again, I literally stumbled into it. I remember 7 years ago, I felt like is when this stuff started really to come together, and or like podcasting became a lot more popular. And I was listening to NBA basketball podcasts just beginning, and I started Googling stuff around adapted physical education. I couldn't find anything, and I naively enough said, I'm going to do that. And if you listen to my first few episodes, especially, you can tell I was stumbling through them. And I took it upon myself to try to start something like that. As this has evolved over the years, and again, I put it into my research, into my practice of teaching college courses and all this, I view it as a lens to try to give a voice to a variety of adapted physical activity professionals across the globe. And I definitely interact with lots of different topics, including philosophy and conceptual things. I talk to teachers, I talk to professionals, I talk best practice. I love talking about like controversial things. Sometimes like what is a disability or what is adapted physical education. And I do know it's being used from self-reporting in about 15 college courses across the nation, which is one of the most exciting things I get to say is that people supplement their content and stuff. Another thing that's been really, really impactful for me is that teachers, and it's not often, but they will tell me like, they listen while they're being itinerant and going from one job to the other, which are great. Yeah, so some of my top episodes, and I always send out an email at the end of the year to like the people that kind of meet the top 3 episodes of that year all time. But it's been interesting because some of them are, and these are of all time, but behavior management, I think was done in my first year. Dr. Barry LeVay was on there. So that's been one that's been consistently used and the #1. Disability models I did with Dr. Nancy Spencer in Canada. We talked about what is a disability. And then I have one with Dr. Mitchell Yell from the University of South Carolina on special ed law and APE. I find these to be interesting because I think that there's some like best practices things that intertwine, but they're kind of random a little bit. And what seems to be what people listen to and stuff. So yeah. All right. So this is so this has been a real journey for me. I started this out naively. It was right around when I started my journey to going to my PhD at Texas Women's University. And it was like right before I did that. And when I did that, I went into this again very naively, maybe more naively than everyone else. And with that, like what I have found is that I learned so much, and I'm sure the other podcast hosts can say this too, but I am really like privileged to be able to sit across from scholars and professionals and practitioners that have incredible knowledge and skills. And then I usually have to craft up questions for them. I have to read their papers, I have to look at their work, and I have to create that, and I have to navigate these conversations. And so honestly, I feel super privileged to have accidentally been in this position because it's allowed me to make friends. It's allowed me to collaborate with wonderful scholars and also to hear their voices and understand and really get a much better understanding of the field myself. So I hope that when people listen, they're getting some of that, but I feel really honored to be the host sometimes because I get so much from I call it like the best professional development I can get. And again, I'm sure the other hosts can kind of say that too. And then, podcasts, in my eyes, they provide a means for people to connect. I think that people, and this has been something that has been told to me from some of our APE listeners, and Chris, maybe you had this too, is like that oftentimes APE people feel like they are on an island by themselves. They don't have any collaborators, sometimes in their whole district, sometimes even in large, like they feel like they're the only person in their state, depending on where they're at. And that's been another big honor for me, is that people sometimes feel like these are really nice to kind of connect and feel like somebody's talking their language, understands what they've been through, and so on and so forth. So now, until recently, Chris, Chris, you have I think it's the Talking APE podcast, right? So, he just started about, what, 2 months ago, something along those lines?
Feels a lot longer than that, yes, but about 2 months.
So, in 7 years' time, there has been really little kind of other APE podcasts out there. And I just feel like the biggest thing that I get emailed about or contacted, and again, I don't get contacted that much from listeners, but when I do, the number one thing they ask for is more. Sometimes there's other stuff, whatever, about quality or something I said weird, but oftentimes it's more, and we want more. And right before we started this, the three of us were talking, 3 podcast hosts were talking about how hard it is to sustain these podcasts in any quality. And I'm really happy Chris has started one in the APE realm, because we need more of these. I should not be the only voice out there. And we really need to create more of these, because these are a way people are connecting and learning and engaging in our field. That. All right. Yeah. Other thing, this comes from some of my research too. But we as podcast creators, I think, have a lot of responsibility. I think people are listening to this for to engage with their profession and such. And there's not too many of us out there. There's a dozen of us that have real listenerships, and we need to take that responsibility and that ownership, I believe. That's something else. I think that podcasting can be something like the wild, wild west, because there's no oversight over us. And I think that it's really, really important that we check ourselves and that the listeners check us when they can too, because, again, people are listening to these, and oftentimes, like I said, 15 college courses are listening to mine. Risto's is much bigger than mine. I'm sure he has more than that listening to his. So we need to respect our listeners. We need to be checked. We need to make sure that we have quality guests on. We have good questions. We have good topics, so on and so forth. And again, it's just been an honor to be able to, to have people listening to my podcast. So I think that's it. So, sorry. Our field is incredibly diverse and full of innovative and creative professionals, and I'm happy to try to give those people a voice. So that's what I got.
All right. So my name is Risto Marttinen. I'm an associate professor at George Mason University, which is just outside of Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia. So I host the Playing with Research in Health and Physical Education podcast, which is a mouthful, and it doesn't fit on a Twitter handle. So then I made a new Twitter handle, and now it's called @the HPE podcast. So I'm not a branding person or a marketing person, so therefore it's a little confusing. But I basically launch a podcast every Tuesday at 7 a.m. And I've been doing that for 5 years. Last summer, I took the summer off and not putting stuff up. And that was the first break that I had and not putting them out. So put about 277 episodes out so far. And there's just a ton of material in there. It's not all original material that I'm like interviewing people. So we put in the ARA SIG 93, which is the special interest group for PE, for the American Educational Research Association. All of our webinars are up on there. The audio is. Also, I'm Secretary General for ICEP, which is an international organization for higher education and PE. So if you don't know that organization, I super highly suggest you look that up. We have some crossover for APE in that organization as well. We have a conference in Chile this summer and one in Finland next year. But so all of their ICEP Connect meetings go on there. The Peak Collaborative goes on there. If people want to do a podcast and put it up there, I put it up there. It's a place for researchers to be able to communicate their research. So the most traditional format that I have is an article overview. So if Scott sends me an article, I send him some questions, he preps those questions, and then he explains that article through conversation. Then we have some theory breakdowns. So like Justin Hagel came on very early on the podcast and talked about intersectionality. And I just cut that little piece out and it's 10, 15 minutes to explain something. Or the theory of planned behavior, there's like a 10, 12-minute podcast on that. I've done some article clubs, which is me and a couple of my colleagues just pick an article. We were doing this once every couple months for a while, and we all read it and then come in and have a conversation, kind of like a doctoral seminar would be. So those have been really fun. I've done a couple of book clubs on different books where I just literally post it on Twitter and I say, who wants to read this book at the same time and have a conversation? And sometimes it's 2 people and sometimes it's 15. So when I have and I also only do it for audiobooks because I don't know, I guess that's me as a podcaster. If it's on audiobook, I'm signing up for the book club, but if it's a hard copy book, it's not going to happen. Yeah, and then I've recently started doing more like article summaries. So basically I write a 1,000-word or 1,300-word summary of an article, and then I basically just dictate it into a microphone and talk through it so there's no guest. And Scott and Chris, I've thought about doing this through Chat GPT to enter my information there, and it puts out, and I've already tried it. It does put out a pretty good short summary. So I'm thinking about doing that for all of my articles and just throwing it out there. So why I do this, it is very simple. I want to provide access to high quality research for free. There's a bunch of paywalls in our industry that keeps research away, whether it's not understandable, so it's too complex for people to read that are undergraduate students. I want the researcher to explain what's happening. I want to highlight especially young scholar work. So people who are just coming up, I want them to have a name that people know them. And very selfishly, I want to do this for my classes. So when I go through and talk about the top episodes, a lot of those were because I needed some other content for my students so they could read. I've polled them privately, like said, this is an anonymous survey. Can you please be honest? When I give you a research paper, do you A, read it fully, skim it, do not read it, or do you actually give us papers? And so most of them, like I think it's like 10, 15% read in depth the research papers in my classes. So I know it's not a way for me to communicate research. So if I have a research paper, I try to reach out to that person and have them on a podcast to talk about it. So I'll quickly go in the next slide and show you very briefly what I research in general outside of what I do as a podcast is the main thing, and you can see kind of here, the timeline here until the pandemic shut us down is this long-term project with Reach after school program. So it's a physical activity, sports-based after-school program that integrates literacy and character development. So we've run some programs in New York, run some programs in California, and then a partnership with the Peace Corps. And then I've done some research on other integrations, so STEM into PE, some student attitude and physical education work, because my advisor is Steve Silverman, and that's just where you go with Steve, you talk about student attitude. And then some very tiny emerging interest in policy, because I'm so close to DC that probably makes sense. And so here's some information about the podcast. When I show you this, the numbers don't matter. Like for the first year, I think I had like 20 people listening to the podcast, and it was helping me for my class. And that's why I did it. And I know that consistency brings it. A lot of the people who are listening to this are listening to it because they want to hear people from AERA talk or ICEP talk or the Peak Collaborative talk. So those are not my numbers. And also, like, a full caveat here, I have an amazing PhD student who does a lot of the background work, and that's why I've been able to keep this productive. And I tell her that all the time. Like, there's no way I'm putting out an episode every week unless she's not doing the preliminary read through the article, doing some questions, sending the script that I look over, then I read the paper. So there would be no way I could keep up this pace. So it's also interesting that most of my listeners are outside of the US. So even though 46% of US is there, there's a lot of international listenership, and those numbers change, especially if I have an Australian scholar. They tend to, for whatever reason, bring a lot of people in. And then you can see the domination that Apple Podcasts has, and how almost 75% of the podcasts are downloaded from Apple Podcasts. So kind of shows a little bit. And then Spotify just took over where I host. I used to host on Anchor, and Spotify bought it. So now it kind of gives me some new information, like 1,000 people follow the podcast, which does not translate to downloads. But I'll show you I think it's the next slide. I have the top episodes. And again, no rhyme or reason. Like, I don't understand how this works. I get the number episode 1 and 2. Ash Casey talks about model space practice. A lot of people listen in on that. But then other ones like Sport Education Series 1, but not the second one. The tactical games model is just me talking about what I talk about in my class. It's a tactical games lecture. The Australian Physical Education Program has on top 3 review, but those are all things like I use episode 2 in my class. I use the theory breakdown, self-determination theory. I use a sport education one. I have them listen to the episode 121 model space practice. Meaningfulness in PE comes in one of my classes. 119 is experiences teaching LGBTQ students. My students just listened to that last week, and we had a discussion about it. The Spectrum of Teaching Styles series is there as well. So again, selfishly, these are the things I use to support my students' learning. So I'll show you the last slide, which is this Google Doc, and it is categorized by topic. So if you look at adapted physical education, you can scroll to page 41, and you'll see the link and the summary and who the guest was. And so this is kind of a resource for teachers to just go through and look at where topics are. So if you're trying to add some content that you might need for your class, I've made Alba has updated this every couple months to keep that up to date. So it's 10 minutes, 4 seconds. I thought I was gonna talk for 5. There you go. That's what you get for asking a podcaster to come on.
That's all right. I'll make up for you going 10 minutes and 4 seconds, because mine is going to seem very amateur compared to the 2 prolific podcasters in front of me. As it was mentioned, mine is obviously brand new to the space. I need to thank both of you for putting out the content you do, because it does make the field better. And then I have to especially thank Scott, because Scott's been kind enough to have phone calls with me, kind of explain how you even go from 0 to putting one out. And he couldn't have been nicer about that. So I'm really grateful for that. So a little bit about myself professionally. I am a lead adapted PE teacher in the San Diego Unified School District. I share that position with 2 other wonderful colleagues who I know are listening in right now. So just giving them a little shout out. I still do carry 1 school site. We're itinerant based in San Diego. I still carry a high school with that. So I'm in the office, but I'm also in the field. I think it's kind of the blend of both worlds, as I can then say to our teachers, I do in fact still know what it's like to teach. Prior to that though, I would have as many as 8 or 9 schools in a year as just your itinerant AP teachers, as many of those on the call know. I received a nice recognition from my department in 2018, and I've taught preschool all the way through high school now. As far as the podcast, it's just adapted PE teachers discussing their everyday experiences. We focus on assessment, best practices, finding resources, and we've touched on some lesson structure. A little bit more personal information about me. I am very proud of the fact that I was a 9-year member of our what is now called our CP national soccer team. It used to be called the Paralympic national soccer team. I played in the 2007, 2011 World Cups, and I played in the Paralympic Games in London in 2012. I'll save everyone the time though. Just because you know I was on the roster is simply enough. You do not need to go look up the results, as they were less than stellar. It's basically like, oh, Chris made the team. All right, I get it. They were probably near the bottom there. So, but it was a wonderful experience nonetheless. And one I am really proud of, even though I am a little bit self-deprecating in my approach. Currently, I chair what's called U.S. Soccer's Athletes Council, and I am a member of the board of directors. So that's kind of my background. And then I have one more slide to share with everyone. My podcast, candidly, is too new to provide all of that great data that the other podcasters have been able to provide. But just the what and the why of it. So it's just intended to give everyday teachers an opportunity to share their work. Currently through halfway through season 1, and season 1 will be 8 to 10 episodes. I'm going to have to do a season format because there's just no way I can continue on a weekly pace. So to those that can get it out, that's great. Melissa is actually going to be our next episode, as we went really deep on assessment. A ton of fun. Thank you, Melissa, for coming on. I also see that Heidi Ambrosius is on the call, and Heidi has been on the schedule, but because of scheduling difficulties, we've had to cancel, and we are going to make that happen though, Heidi, for sure. That is definitely going to be a thing that will get you. So, but why? So whether it was Facebook or Twitter, I was just really taken aback by all of the fantastic work that I was seeing being shared. And I was like, wow, there are some incredible teachers out there doing incredible things. But I thought that a lot of that work I thought warranted a deeper conversation. And so I just decided that podcasting would be that forum, I guess. And that's when I reached out to Scott. So it's an opportunity for adaptive PE teachers to learn from those practicing in the field. Not only, as Scott referenced, there's just not many in adapted phys ed. I just thought that there was a need for the voice of the everyday teacher to be heard, to draw on those practical real world experiences where they could share. Also, as I would go through, whether it be Twitter or Facebook in the groups, I started to notice that even though we're all adapted physical education teachers, it felt like things are being done differently around the country, whether it comes to the assessment process or how, we have this buzz sort of thing where we say it's a service, not a placement, yet around the country, it feels like it's a placement. And I wanted to understand that better and go deeper on that. And I thought that it would be a good platform for people to ultimately learn for each other. And then let me just make sure I've covered all these. Yeah, I think that's it. So I've put out 6 episodes so far. And I would say the biggest topic we've discussed, it's been funny, I actually didn't plan it this way, but my first 3 episodes were filled with teachers who are fantastic at using switches and leaf blowers to meet the needs of their students. And that has been a very big topic. And to Risto's point of the numbers don't matter, they really don't. I got an email from a teacher in the middle of nowhere, California, who just thanked me for putting it out there that they were going to go try an assessment they learned about on the podcast that they weren't aware of, and they were going to go try using a leaf blower. And their biggest concern now is, where were they going to store this type of equipment? So that point, I'd love to tell everyone that I'm getting Joe Rogan level downloads, but that would just obviously be a bold-faced lie. And I'm pretty happy when I break 200, 300, 400 plays, and I know that's not the same as a download, and I know that doesn't even include play completion, and there's a lot of factors to the stats here, but I'm proud of where it is. It probably, to those of you listening, does still feel very amateurish, but that's because an amateur is doing it, and I'm just hoping I can improve a little by little. But I'm proud of the work I've put out there, and I hope, and from what I can tell, it's been well received. So as I said, I'd be the shortest, and there you go.
All right, thank you to the 3 of you. Much, much appreciated. Next, let's open it up for any questions for our 3 podcasters. And then after that, we have a kind of philosophical questions that we'll pose to our 3 podcast panelists. So any questions first to our 3 podcast experts? No, they answered everything so thoroughly.
I just want to say thank you because this is so needed, all of these podcasts within the PE and APE community. So kudos to you guys, because I know this is a lot of hard work on your part. And I'm one of those commuters that I throw these podcasts on in my car while I'm driving to and from work. And it is just appreciated. So I don't care what those numbers say, those we're listening and we appreciate all of your hard work. So I just wanted to say thank you.
I wanted to hop in and chime in right after Heidi. I so love all these podcasts. They're fantastic. And I wondered if any of you three gentlemen have plans in the future of doing one on for mamas or mamas to be for what APE looks like or PE looks like in those months coming back postpartum to work. I'd love to see an episode like that. So I was wondering if any of you had that in the works.
I hadn't thought of that. Danielle, thanks for calling that out. I think that's a little bit of my male privilege showing through there, that it wasn't on my radar, probably, being candid with you. But it actually does hit close to home because we just had our second daughter last May, and then I had to come back to work. Very different than a woman coming back. Let me preface that. I get it, but that's a great call out, and I certainly would be open to doing something like that.
That's fantastic. I love hearing that.
Just to concur, I think that's an awesome topic to have. And probably one that we could have for the general PE world too, of like how do people navigate that? Probably the three people here are probably not the greatest people to talk on that, but we could have guests on that could probably talk about that a lot better.
Thank you guys for being so open to that. I really appreciate it. Being in the APE desert that I am, I know that was quite a tricky thing for me to handle. So I'm sure that there are other people out there that felt the same way.
Yeah, and again, just anybody that has ideas, I was actually just sharing with Melissa and Risto and Scott on before this that my format is, I'm going to hit a stalling point because at the end of the day, I'm basically having the same conversation. And so I am going to hit a stalling point just naturally. And I think that's why you see when you have 277 episodes, you have to diversify what you're offering your listeners. So I appreciate Danielle, again, great call out, appreciate it. And any of you that have ideas, please bring them forward. It certainly does help, quite honestly, not stepping on toes.
Yeah, and it's so good to hear that from listeners, from colleagues, like just to give, because when you put your head down and you're like trying to edit these episodes and pushing the content out, you kind of get like sometimes like tunnel vision. So I remember in going from my first to my second year, I've had probably 40, 50 people on, just like I'm looking at Google Scholar, I get an alert and I look at this person, I ask them to come on, and that's like the process. And one of my really good friends said, you should really think about the diversity of guests on your podcast. And I'm like, what do you mean? I don't have any bias. And I looked at the people that I have had, and it was very much like people who I knew, the research that I liked, and I wasn't looking at representation at all. And this was a good colleague that knew that she could say this to me. And I started thinking about things differently. And those are things like, Chris, you might have, or Scott, you might have not thought about that is an issue because that's not the lived experience that you have. And that's so important. Like, we're very open to hearing the feedback and saying like, these are topics that are of interest to us. Can you talk about that? So thank you.
Great question, Danielle. I'm going to,
Melissa,
go ahead.
can I just piggyback off that quickly? I was just going to say that to that point, I certainly, my approach was trying to get people from different parts of the country to at least, that's a very simplistic view on the point that Risto just made in terms of diversifying listeners. But I realized that I was even though I live in California, I was very East Coast focused. And obviously there's so many deeper layers to this because we can add in gender and sexuality and race and all of that as well. But I mean, the initial lens I took is I realized that I was just focusing on kind of where I came from, because that's still where a lot of my points of contact are. And so it's a really good point. And you don't realize how conscious you have to be of these things until you're sitting in the chair and realize that to provide a fair lens, you have to pull back out a little bit.
I add one thing on that. It's more just being called out, like Risto was saying. I've had like 3 times probably I've been called out with like I had somebody on that was a guest that was basically trying to sell something to whatever. And I got called out on like, I just let him talk, sell his product, and I didn't ask any hard-hitting questions. There's been a few other examples, maybe not that specific, but like those things have changed my practice in my view, and what I do. And Risto, you probably have a similar thing of when you've been called out, like those things are really impactful. And I just think that like, again, like the listeners' voices are so important, but we don't always hear them because we're putting them out into like this, like the internet abyss or whatever. And we don't know what's happening. We see numbers, but there's not a lot of like other communication. So that feedback is so vital, and it really does change, I think, how we kind of go about like, what we're doing.
Great, thanks, panelists. Next question, and a couple of you mentioned this in your short talks. Why is there a disconnect between research theory to practice?
I guess, okay. Yeah, I think that there is a lot of things. Risto already talked about the pay walls that often exist for journals. And like, there's this academic grind and expectation that we're pumping out research and we're doing research. And again, the better journals often are the ones that have bigger paywalls. So it's like this weird contrary thing of, what helps us in our career doesn't help, doesn't translate very well. I also think that we speak in jargon. A lot of jargon is used, especially you start talking about data analysis and all these things. And then also I think relevancy. And I think teachers have to sift through things to find the relevant piece of information to them. And not all research is relevant to practice. And I'm not sure it needs to be when we talk about like theoretical stuff and all that, but like, so we don't do a good job of providing, hey, here is the relevant information within these things, or calling out that this article is relevant. And I think I've tried to do this. I think research done a really good job of trying to put these things in, of highlighting the relevant parts of research and also putting it in understandable means, because the way that we write is, I mean, it's, whatever, we all try to sound as smart as we can, which means use words that nobody's ever says in their language, or like no one actually says. So yeah.
Yeah, I think the academic language is the barrier. Like the way you have to write a paper to get it accepted into a good journal is not approachable to a freshman in my 200 level class, right? The stuff, and that's why I think the podcasts that I host make sense to those students, because we skip over any data analysis, we skip over like the major methods. Now that's important for a researcher, but they can go read the paper, right? I started the podcast because I wish during my commute from downtown Los Angeles to Fullerton on the train that I could listen to something that helps my practice, that I could, listen to a podcast that talks about research instead of when I'm riding my bike, like I can't read, but I can listen to something, And so I think the way academic papers are, they have to be rigorous because they have to be, able to be repeated. And so, you look at like sport education model, like the reason why it's so technical is because that paper has to be, or that study has to be able to be repeated by somebody else, and they should get the same results. But that's not what you care about as a practitioner. You want to know, what did you find? Why is it important? What do we know about this? And summarize it and have it in a conversational format. And I think, academic journals serve a purpose, but Joperd or Strategies is a way more approachable journal. But for researchers and universities, they don't get the same credit for publishing those. I know like my advisor, Steve Silverman, he's like, I've never published a paper in JOPERD ever. And I'm like, it's great because he's a good scholar, but at the same time, the readership of JOPERD and strategies is so much higher than Research Quarterly and Exercise and Sport.
Yeah, I
That's
think
sort of your,
yeah, thanks, Melissa. I think my perspective is going to be a little different as, leading a department now of 39 other teachers. And Scott, I don't know, I'm sure you remember, but we actually did do a podcast episode of yours on this exact topic. And I believe I'm attached as an author, but to say I'm an author is not fair at all, as you did the heavy lifting on that paper that got in. So, but we actually tried to take a look at this and to figure out kind of, where is this disconnect? And so there's a few things for me is that I think the academic language piece that's interesting. I hadn't given that much thought before, but I do think it's really fair. But I think when we're dealing with professionals in the field, I'd love to tell you that all 39 of my teachers subscribe to JOPERD or whatever, you name it, and that the research is getting in front of them. But the reality is that's just not the case. It sits behind paywalls. I think that's actually one of the biggest deterrents to getting the research in front of practicing teachers, is that it sits behind paywalls. And I know that again, Scott's great. He's like, hey, if you see something I put out and you want it, just ask me. He's like, I'd rather like I'll give it to you and you can share it out like that. That's great. So I think that is one of the problems. Another problem, at least I find specific to adapted PE, is I don't know that I'm going to choose my language well enough for the professors on the call, but it seems that as though some of the research is very specific to a very specific field that actually impacts very few adapted PE teachers in the field. So there's not enough general research, in my opinion, that applies to it. So I remember on that episode with Scott, the example I gave was, why is reading taught in elementary classrooms the way it is? And I presume, I haven't looked up research articles on it, but that research has been done to subscribe to the fact that reading is taught a certain way because that's how kids learn. And that's come through time and literally centuries at this point, right? Et cetera. But I can't necessarily regularly point to research I feel coming out that truly improves the everyday practice of the everyday adapted PE teacher. So an example would be, and all of you might say, Chris, that research does exist, you just haven't seen it. But an example I might give is, does video modeling greatly improve skill acquisition in our autistic learners? The research may exist, I just haven't seen it. Let's say that does exist, and the answer is yes. That's research I would want to be sharing with my 39 teachers that I oversee. So for me, it's a little bit that it's behind paywalls. And then in our field, it just feels like a lot of the research that I do see, and maybe it's just who I follow on Twitter, maybe that's part of, I have to expand my lens. It just feels that it's just very specific to certain areas and isn't more general, can be applied more generally to the field.
all right.
Real quick, I'm just going to share. I don't know if you can see this because I have this weird screen thing, but there's a recent book that came out by Anthony Marr and Justin Hagel called Teaching Disabled Children Physical Education: Disconnections Between Research and Practice. And they go through different disabilities and different evidence-based practices in our field. And they talk about what the actual research shows. But a lot of it is actually pointed to the lack of research that we have on it, which I think is even like so often what we say is we have to do X, Y, and Z with this group is sometimes based on one study. And that's not, for the researchers on here, that's not what we want. So I think what you're saying is really, really valuable. And I think what we're talking about is really valuable about that disconnection that we have with research to practice. And I especially think in the physical education realm in general, but I think in APE, part of the problem is that we don't have the research to show, like you said, Chris.
I just bought that book, so I'll be looking forward to digging into it.
Great, Scott, Scott, would you put it in the chat, the name of the book? Sorry, Risto, go ahead.
And that's also the dissemination of research. That's one of the issues. Like, Chris, you have a full-time job. Your full-time job is not to be a researcher digging through archives and finding the relevant information. That is a part of research that professors should be doing, but often they're not, right? It's the dissemination of knowledge. If you're writing a research paper, you should probably put it up on ResearchGate so it's free, the preprint on ResearchGate so it's free, write a blog about it. Like, I know Tim Fletcher from Brock University does really good work. He has blogs summarizing his main work on that website. But it's that step that a lot of researchers don't do, because it's like you put the paper in, it goes behind a paywall, I get credit on my Vita, I get promoted, and then next I do it again, right? So that's where I think that state organizations, national organizations have kind of a duty for that. Capered, right? Shape America, other organizations that could, and sometimes too, like I know Shape America does these like research summaries, or were doing it for a while, that they would highlight a 300-word summary of research. But, yes, there's some role that teachers play in finding that information, but it can't be the same that you expect from a person who has a full-time job doing research. So there has to be some dissemination there.
Great. Thanks all. The next question is going to be fields of general physical education, adapted physical education. Oftentimes we are very separate and don't come together enough. Should we be more unified, for example, within Shape America or conferences, as opposed to our current separation for most of our activities?
I'll go first, I guess, since I don't know that we have a real order here. I think there's layers to this, Melissa. So I think generally speaking, I think definitely, and I'm actually going to draw on my U.S. soccer experience here of just how impactful it is to be an individual with a disability that sits in the boardroom and advocates for national teams from the disability soccer space. So I can speak to inclusion in that sense and how impactful that is. And I think that as our field of whether it's general phys ed or adapted phys ed continues to evolve, I think having more of the voices from both sides at the table makes sense. I also want to recognize that, SCAPE and the National Adapted PE Conference and the historical relevance that holds, because nothing was happening at the time. And so, that's how that came to be. But where I was going with the levels is that you brought up a national level, but it also happens at our grassroots levels of the districts. And so in my district now, the Adapted Physical Education Department is part of the Health and Physical Education Department within San Diego Unified. So we, as leaders in the field, are at the leadership meetings involving all of those domains and can have those discussions about what does physical education and adapted physical education look like across our district. So I think it's really important that I think it can be both. I think obviously organizations like SCAPE and then also Shape America certainly serve their purpose, but there can be, to sound super buzzy right now, but if we were a Venn diagram and, where do we land in the middle? Can there be some shared space in the middle? I think absolutely. And then I think in the layers that are below that, whether it's at the collegiate level, like the work you're doing, how much crossover is there between the kinesiology pedagogy that's taking place as well as with the adaptive physical education side. I know coming from SUNY Brockport, there was quite a bit, we were kind of all housed in the same area, and you had professors that had specialties in both. And then again, the next layer is what's happening, in the various municipalities and school districts around the country. Are they siloed off? Some of the people I've talked to on mine, they're one of one adapted PE teacher in their whole district. And so that's just them, and they're out there grinding away, crushing it. And then obviously we've just recently had a shift in our district in the last, I guess, 3 to 4 years, I would say, as in that we used to be part of the related services department, and that houses things like OT and PT, but we were not connected to physical education. So that's kind of my thought, is that I think we can have a silo for each, as long as we're meeting in the middle at times, for sure. And then I think as we go down through, if that kind of approach could happen at every level, I think everyone would benefit.
Yeah. Risto, please.
No, I totally agree. I love how, Chris, you talked about it. Like, there are reasons for those silos. Like, you do good work when you are working with people who fully understand you. But I think, Melissa, this is a great example of, like, you reach out to me to ask me to come on to this conversation. Same thing I do for, like, we just had an ARA panel of journal editors. Like, we wanted to have adapted physical activity quarterly on there because that is part of PE, right? And when we talk about representation for peak collaborative topics, we talk about who are we adding, who are we asking to come, and it's extending that hand and saying, please come with us. And it's the same thing we've done with the American Educational Research Association special interest group. We have a, I don't know, rumor or whatever that we don't accept adapted PE work, which is not true. Like, we want that in, but because for whatever reason, there's some idea that that's not a space for me, we actively go out and talk to people and like, hey, have you thought about submitting to ARA? Like, we have a deadline in mid-July for 2024. Like, do you want to come in and present? And that's where, like, you have to have advocacy for it. You have to actually invite people to come along. Otherwise, though, there is no middle space. We are going to stay in our silos, and we're going to yell from the silos to each other and say, why don't you invite us over?
If I could add just like two things. One is more from the academic side, but I believe there's been a trend in the last 5+ years for the general PE world to accept us more. That's including in the podcast realm and so on and so forth. But that's how in journals and at conferences, they seem to be much more, from what I understand from a historical lens, they seem to be accepting and talking to us, and we're part of that group more and more, which I think is good. And if that like is a top-down thing and happens in the schools, I'm not sure, but I think that's great. What I will say is, Chris and Melissa, you're in California, which has really strong APE programming. I've been living in a few deserts as the last few years in Iowa and New Hampshire. Like Danielle said, in Colorado, there's these deserts, and there is little I agree, there needs to be a strong connection between the two. But what I have found is that when you're in a desert, there's none of the APE silo conferences, professional development associations that can lend you support in your state. And so I think in a way, then they end up kind of being sucked into general physical education and having nobody to bounce their ideas off of or anything like that, or grow, have a struggle to grow professionally because there's no APE association or networks there. And so I just think it's really vital, and I think all of us are saying that we do have a home base of people that do focus on IEPs and disability best practices and collaborating with the IEP teams and all these other services and such, because those are really vital to our service delivery and such. And again, I'm in speaking from like a desert APE landscape. When you don't have that, I think it hurts your profession and the professionals in it. So
Great. Thanks all. At this time, we'll open it up one last opportunity for anyone in the audience to ask a question to our panelists.
Hi, everyone. I don't have a question, and you're going to have to excuse my nasal sounding voice, but that's what happens when you live down south in Alabama, and the pollen is absolutely ridiculous, and we won't go any further. But my name is Janine Fittipaldi-Wirt. I'm a professor at Columbus State University, and I'm a director of capabilities in Columbus, GA. And I just have to say that I appreciate that I got this email, because this has been one of the most refreshing conversations I've ever had in a very long time. Well, at least that I've been able to hear, because I feel like sometimes I'm kind of on a boat all by myself, where I'm not real big into conducting research, and I get kind of knocked in the head a little bit that that's what I'm supposed to do. And my focus is more of being on the practitioner side of the house, and how can I help train our upcoming new physical education teachers, and hopefully increase in interest in adapted PE through all the courses I teach, along with training a ton of teachers already out in the schools. So it is very refreshing to hear that I am not the only one who feels that, yes, while research is needed, of course it is, that we need to find ways that we can help educators out there and our upcoming students, well, the students that are going to be educators, how they can have an understanding of all of this, along with not just a focus on one disability, but all. Because anymore now in physical education and in adapted PE, as we all know, there are a variety of ability levels. And so there is no just one answer. So I just want to say thank you, because thank you is all I can tell you, but I'll be quiet from there. But this has been awesome. So thanks.
Great, thank you so much. And on behalf of NCPEID, I want to thank our 3 panelists. You all did a fantastic job. Much appreciated for coming on and showcasing your podcasts, and also just answering some questions there at the end. In the chat, I have any recommendations if anyone would like to give for future NCPEID APE collaboratives. And in April, we are planning to have some Shape America APE Teacher of the Years on for a panel discussion. So that'll be coming up, date and time to be determined. So coming soon in April. Thank you all again for joining us today, especially that fun-filled introduction with the Zoom bombing. It's been a while since we've had a Zoom bombing. But thanks all for joining us today. And again, thank you to the panelists. Bye all, till next time.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.